I'm going to do just a little bit of recap. We'll go back and I'm going to pick up the alphabet and go through that a little bit. Because with perfect tense, it gets a little more involved. Present active indicative, pretty simple. The future active indicative, pretty simple because it's just adding a sigma to, the same endings that we have for present active indicative. So on the chart, starting at the left with our endings, present active indicative, the future active indicative, we move to the right. It's just adding a sigma between the ending and the stem. In this case, the root. So now we're going to make a jump and we're going to head to the perfect active indicative. So it's far to the right there. And it looks a bit different, but it shares the same endings as the present and the future. So we'll jump there and then we'll get to the middle and passive and so on. But there's two key things when we look at perfect tense. There are changes that happen in perfect tense on the front of the word and at the end of the word. So if you look in your chart, their perfect active indicative, we have that prefix on the front there, le, so we call reduplication, and then we have the kappa, which is the tense stem indicator that tells us it's a perfect. So we're going to look at the first part, the reduplication. Why is there le, right, on the front of there? And then next time we'll come back and look at the endings, because there's more involved with perfect tense and changes, but it all comes back to the alphabet. So we're going to review this, and then I'll give you an example of what happens at the end of the perfect when we form them, and then we'll look at the reduplication and try to understand it. But going back to the alphabet, we have the unvoiced, the voiced, we have gutturals, alveolars, and labials. We have our unvoiced guttural, kappa, okay, and all we're concerned with is the sound. And remember, it's really cool to me, the more I keep going through and just keep reminding myself that when we're dealing with the language, it's the phonetic aspect, the sounds that cause the change. So I'll show you a couple of examples, and you'll just start seeing them all over. You'll start to be able to look at this and sort of piece things together, and you'll see these changes that happen. So we'll just keep going back and picking up threads of thought and walking through. We have then the voiced, gamma, and unvoiced is what? If we say a letter is unvoiced, what are we saying? Okay, so there's no sound, or we say which is caused by the vocal cords, right? So it's depending on the vibration, and that's what makes that sound. So we have k, 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 g, g, right? So the gamma is a little deeper, and that part of the reason why some refer to these as palatals, because the idea we say kappa, k, 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 k. They want to say it like our English K, keep. That K, we put it more up on the front hard part of our mouth, but actually in Greek, it's farther back, right? It's that soft part, the velum. So it's more of a guttural than it is a palatal, right? And the realization of this came to me, although I've seen them labeled this way, was when we were doing Russian, because it deals a lot with like the back of the throat and some of the sounds that are made. So then we have gamma, g, 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 and it's still on that soft part. So this is why I refer to them as gutturals. When Sanskrit you have gutturals and you have palatals, but their vocabularies or their alphabet's a little more extensive. Then we have the alveolars. Why are they called alveolars? Awesome. So its point of articulation is that ridge, the alveolar ridge right behind the teeth. So we have our unvoiced and then d, 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 our voiced delta. And then our labials, which is just lips. And we have p, 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 and then b, 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 beta is our voiced. And then if we move to aspirate, so aspirate, and so this is one of the interesting things that will happen with the perfect tenses. So we have aspirate, so then we see changes. Oftentimes we deaspirate a letter, right? So when we looked at the aspirates, these are the signs or the symbols that reflect the sound, ki, theta, fi, right? But we know that they're a combination of a kaha, right? Taha and paha. And that H is put there, but basically it's rough breathing. And it's interesting that as we move down the line a little bit, I'll show you some terms that change. Where we get an aspirated letter where there was a sigma, and the sigma dropped, and then there was this rough breathing mark, and then when you take, say like a preposition that has like a P, right? Pi in there. If you put it on the front, it actually aspirates it and changes. So it's just going back and just constantly going back to the alphabet. If you have it really ground, you'll start putting some of these pieces together for yourself. But these are basically just a combination of our unvoiced, whether guttural, alveolar, or labial, and then the aspiration. And it isn't as accentuated as, you know, oftentimes I'll do, because when we speak quickly. So we do that even in English when we hurry up on our speech, especially if we're, you know, speaking just in the vernacular on the street. We're moving things along. So it sounds as though when you hear words, you're dropping letters and things like that. So it won't always sound as pronounced, right? Te'as, right? Sometimes you say it and you just say it quickly, te'as, right? So you don't even hardly hear that aspiration, but it's there. And the point isn't so much worrying about you pronouncing these letters that way all the time. It's just knowing that that's how they're pronounced, because then the change that happens makes sense. Yeah? So we're not going to be sticklers about it, but just to know. And then we have the sibilant. So basically it was the guttural, kappa plus a sigma. And then we have the labials, psi, which is a combination of p, unvoiced, plus sigma. And then as it went, then whenever you'd have a combination of sigma with any of these, right, it would become the same thing, psi. Okay? Or if you have a combination of any of these with the sigma, it becomes psi, right? So at one point it was just the combination of these two, then it became each one that is a labial or a guttural connected with sigma. This is what it becomes. And keep your eyes out for xi. Okay, one of the examples we'll see in Ephesians 1:4, where we have the sigma alpha, which is an aorist that tells us that's the tense stem marker, but sigma alpha, and then we put it on the term for ekkaleo or ekkalego to call out. So in the alveolars, then we have just the sigma, and because the tau and sigma, because they have that same point of articulation, where the others have two different points of articulation, it's easier to say those two sounds. But because sigma and tau, because that would have been the combination, right? Tau plus sigma, because they have that same point of articulation, they just end up dropping the tau. And essentially it didn't drop, it assimilated to become another sigma. And then it just, you know, you lose that. And I put zeta up here because with zeta, when it's in the middle of a word, it is basically, it's like a sibilant. So it's a DZ sound. If we put it on the front of a word, it's Z. So we have Zoe, life, which is the principle of life, not the life that you live, the actions, which is a really cool reality, because then if we have, right, our life is in Jesus, the Zoe, it is that principle of life, because without that, then you don't have the life that you live. And then when you have it in the middle of a word, it is DZ sound, so, or DS. But we have so, z, 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 right? So, so we put that there, and then you'll see as we go and see different combinations, we'll see why we do it that way. And then we have liquids, lambda, mu, nu, rho. Now, there's different ways to classify these, and I said this before, but so lambda and rho are basically they're laterals as well. So there are other elements to classifying these letters, and we can get really complex with them to look at all the different things. We just get really confusing. So it's like I say, I study a lot to make this really simple and reduce everything down for you. But we can get into all that stuff, but there really isn't any necessity for it as far as what we're doing. So one of the things that we'll look at when we get to the perfects is at the end of a word when we place endings on. So we'll talk about mutes before mutes or consonants before another consonant. So give an example. If we take a labial mute or a labial consonant, p, beta, phi, or a guttural, kappa, gamma, chi, before an alveolar, tau, delta, theta, it becomes coordinate or of the same order with the alveolar. Okay, so that's really short. Sounds really confusing. Simply, it's just this. Okay, so if I have a beta and a tau or a phi and a tau, okay, the tau is going to cause that first letter to change. Okay, and it's going to become of the same order. So P is what? Or let's start with tau first. Tau is what if we classify it? Yeah. Alveolar, okay, and what else? Unvoiced. So P is not an alveolar, P is a labial, but P is also a what? Unvoiced. So because of tau, it's going to cause P to change. So here's what happens when we have the perfect. So we're trying to form a perfect. We have the reduplication. So we reduplicate the first consonant, and we put the vowel epsilon here in between there to make it. So it basically makes another syllable. So when we do perfect tenses, we develop another syllable. But here then we have the endings. My, sai, tai, meth, es, ntai, right? So when I put these endings onto these stems that end with certain letters, it causes a change. So in this case, the tau will cause the beta to change, and it becomes, right, P. So, but notice, this is a labial, this is a labial, okay? This is just causing this, right, to take on the same, unvoiced, right? So, same thing with gegriptai, we love this. So this is grapho, to write, reduplicate the first consonant, and I put this vowel here, so I make another syllable. Get gruff tie, but this tau causes the phi to become P. So this is our final form, gegrup tie, right? So everywhere that Paul or whoever in the New Testament writes, it stands written, that's the word behind it, gegrup tie, right? So when we look at the perfect tense, we have something that happens in the front of the word and something that happens at the end of the word. Okay, so tonight we're just going to focus on what happens on the front of the word. All right, but we have the same thing in English, and we call this regressive assimilation. In other words, the letter causes the one before it to become in like manner as itself, essentially. Okay, so if we take the English example of imperfect, which we've seen before, the root is perfect. It receives a prefix of in, right? So the P is going to cause the end, which is a nasal alveolar, it's going to cause it to become a bilabial nasal, right? So this is essentially what happens. Imperfect becomes imperfect, and implant becomes implant, right? Simple, yes? And it is simple when you think about it, that we're just talking about the sound, right? It's how we pronounce, how we speak it, and that's what causes the changes. So we'll look at those primarily at the end of the word, but we do have some changes that happen on the front of the word. It's usually with the aspirates, with the perfect. So here's a freebie. This is interesting. I was looking at this. So here is in Colossians chapter 2, verse 6. Therefore we have received. This is we have received, or you have received. This is the second person plural, ete, right? So you have received, ton Christon, the Christ Jesus, ton kurion, the Lord. All right, so here is the triliteral root. All right. If you were to look this word up in your dictionary in the back of your Greek text, or in the lexicon if you have one, you won't see la, but you'll see paralambano is what it's going to give in the dictionary. But that's not the root of the word, right? So it's a combination. So essentially we have para, which is the preposition, right, alongside of, and then lambano, okay? But if we just lose a preposition for a moment, and we just look at lambano is essentially lab plus ano. But in certain words, when you put ano at the end, it causes the stem or the root to change in this case, and it'll take a nasal that will go between the alpha and the beta. But notice what happens. What kind of nasal is this? Yeah, so if we think of point of articulation, So if we look at the mu right here, Brandon's going to make you answer all the questions, Dan. You know that. Okay? So mu is our bilabial nasal, right? Both lips, right? And then when I say it, I push the breath up into the nasal cavity when we say it. Well, that's because of this letter right here, B, beta, right? It's a bilabial. Therefore, when they add this ending on, it causes this to happen in between the alpha and the beta, but it's a because of beta. So it's lambano. And it's easier to pronounce, right? Lambano. So here's another example. This is to receive instruction, and it is where we get the word disciple from, mathetes, okay? So if you look it up, but that's the triliteral root, mat. So if you look it up in your dictionary or your lexicon, it's montano, okay? So notice something the same as we've seen the other, right? The ano at the end, and then we have a nasal that comes between the alpha and the theta, right? So here's what it is, triliteral plus ano, which causes the insertion of a nasal between the alpha and the theta because of ano. But notice what happens, n, right? Nu is a alveolar nasal, right? Because this is a what? It's an alveolar aspirate, right? So I know this is getting, right, a little bit deeper, but just to see, there's all these different elements in the Greek language that are going to go back to the alphabet and how these letters, right, are changed, but it's because of pronunciation. Point of articulation, vibration of vocal cords, all of that kind of stuff, but it causes the different changes. So in these particular terms, when you add ano to the triliteral root, like mat in this case, it causes in the root to take a nasal, and it'll come between the alpha and, in this case, the theta, or in the case of lambano, lab is between the alpha and the beta. So here's what's interesting is that you notice in both cases, both of them have an alpha, right? Lab and mat. But it's essentially because when you have ano attached to the end, that's what happens. But it isn't in every term because you have hamartano, right? Talking about sin and so on. So we have that ending. Not all of them change, but certain ones do. And there's quite a few like this. But just to remind you that these things aren't really crazy. And you can look at it and think, man, that's just really confusing. But if you stop and think about it, and how we understand the alphabet, these are just symbols to reflect the phonetic, right, aspect of the language. Then we can see, and even we can see how it makes it easier to pronounce, montano, and it helps it to roll along, right? And a lot of change that comes in languages simply because of pronunciation, right? So perfect active indicative. So tonight I'll introduce, we won't talk about function, we'll just talk about form, and then we'll come back next time and look at function and some of the different changes in form. But we get a little bit more complex now. But present active indicative, then keep in mind when we start saying things this way, and then when you're going through the Greek and you're parsing something down, and you say to yourself, it's perfect active indicative, this is what you need to have in mind. Perfect deals with tense, active deals with voice, indicative deals with mood. Okay? We can have an aorist middle, right? Indicative. Or you can have a present active subjunctive. All of these terms indicate something for us. So when you're pulling a word apart and you get all these different parts, even the terms that we use to describe are telling us something, right? And then if we look at it and say, well, perfect tense, then I'm thinking, right? Tense, we're talking about kind of action, punctiliar with abiding results, right? So all these things need to be in mind as we're walking through this. So this is a little bit different than the way I've done it before. I didn't really spend much time pointing out these things, but getting these things in mind is good for us. So I've gone back and sort of reorienting my notes a little bit. But so when we dealt with tense, the character of an action may be defined from either of 3 points of view. Now, some of this is review, some of this is new. So each time I review, I give you a little something else to go with it. So this is the character of an action may be defined from either of 3 points of view. We have action occurring, action continuous, action completed. And this is just looking at the verb and its function very simplistically. Okay, but we can have nuances to these, but this is just the core idea. So have these in mind and work off the basics. So even like with prepositions, when we dealt with prepositions, we deal with the root meaning of it and then the more remote meanings and so on. But always have that root meaning in mind, because oftentimes you're going to go back to that. So action occurring, action continuous, action completed. So we looked at action occurring, and if we could simplistically sort of indicate this, we'll use the infinitive, but poiesai, to do, right? It's just happening. And this is usually reflected in the aorist. So oftentimes with aorist we think, well, it's usually in past tense when we find it. So we think, well, it's just a simple passive, something that happened in the past. Okay, just think of it, it happened, right? How long it took, that kind of thing, that will come. But you can have, so I can state an action having occurred. It could have taken 40 years. They built the temple, something like that, right? Where it sums up a long period of time in an action. It just happened, right? And it doesn't always have to be in the past. So you'll have an aorist used, say in Mary's song in Luke's Gospel, the Magnificat. In there, the aorist is used, but it's looking to the future, but it's spoken of as completed, right? So it's interesting because it's almost like the Hebrew perfect. It is so sure it's going to happen, it can be spoken of as already having occurred, right? So she's speaking of these things of having occurred, but they're future, not past. So just keep that in mind. So action continuous then. This is poiein, which is to be doing, and it looks at that ongoing process. It can be habitual, right? And there's different ways that we can represent it, either with a straight line unbroken or a bunch of dashes, right? That we see this habitual action ongoing. And then we have the action completed, which is a combination of both. So action occurring is punctiliar, it's a dot. Action continuous is the line. So then we get to action completed, it's the dot and the line, right? And then when we're talking action completed, then we're talking about perfect. So action occurring, aorist. Action continuous, present. Action completed, perfect. And then you'll notice here, because this is the infinitive, but notice we have the reduplication, and then we have kappa, and then here's our ending for the infinitive. To have done. And then if it's pluperfect, like in the past and the results are in the past, then we would do have had or something like that, right, to accentuate it when we translate into English. So these are simple things. Action occurring, action continuous, action completed. We'll keep coming back to these thoughts because they need to be in our head. And since repetition is the mother of all learning, we'll just keep repeating ourselves over and over. Like that crazy uncle that sits in the corner. All right, voice then. In Greek, both voice and tense deal with the action of the verb, but from varying perspectives. Tense focuses on kind of action. The same thing with Hebrew. Whether it's past, present, or future is secondary. The primary thing is what kind of action is it. Time element is sort of a peripheral in a lot of cases. So here's the thing. So then when in Colossians, in chapter 1, verse 17, it says that He is before all things. Before all things, we would think then that would be a past tense. He was before all things. So in English, when you're reading that should cause you to stop and ask yourself, why does he say is here before all things and not was before all things, right? When we look at that, then that is, in a sense, that is what the present tense is in its purest form. We refer to that as an atemporal present. It's essentially that is a state of being, right? He is, right? Past, present, future. He just is before all things. Like it's like our statement that God is, or as God told Moses, I am, right? Tell them I am have. It's just a statement of fact. God is. So just keep that in mind. So when you see those present tenses like that, and then we see it in that kind of context, just remember time isn't the thing. All right? And we would like to rename it all. They should all be just imperfects, imperfect present, imperfect past, imperfect future, but that's just going to be too confusing for everyone. So, voice then, on the other hand, relates action in regards to the subject of the action, and therefore we have the personal ending. So who does it? So we have active voice, subject is acting. He is loosing, and that is the simplistic way to express it, but active voice, he is loosing. So with each of these, I'll give you a little bit of an exegetical insight. So here's what's interesting. 1 Corinthians 7:17, we have, as the Lord has assigned to each one. Okay, and that's the verse, that part of the verse in Greek. And then we have the second part of the verse, as God has called each one. Now, here's what's interesting in both of these. So this is assigned. So to each one, or as each one, hekato. So as each one, and here it is, assigned. Okay, right here is he. He assigned. Who assigned? Hakurios, the Lord assigned. So essentially, this is the subject in relation to the action, right? He did it. This is active, right? But all this does goes to define who that subject is. Because remember, with Greek verbs, the subject is at the end of the verb, right? So he has assigned. Who has assigned? The answer comes, the Lord has assigned. Okay? And both of these are emphatic, each one and hakurios. And notice the second part of the sentence, as God has called each person. Notice, hekastan, same thing. Each one emphatic at the front and ha teos at the end. Both are emphatic in this case. And here is the verb to call. And this is perfect tense, reduplication. But he has called. Who has called? Ha teos is called, right? The Lord has called. And sometimes you won't have this at the end. You'll have to determine from context who the subject is. But that's the active right there. So then we look at middle voice. Subject is participating in results of the action. He is loosing himself, we could say. He is doing this to himself, right? And he benefits from that. So if you have the good guy who's been tied up and bound by the bad guy, right? And the good guy is loosing himself, it is something that he partakes in the results of, right? So it's a lot more involvement. So then it's not just the subject, but it is the involvement that that subject has in the action, or what they benefit from that action happening. Okay, so we can put it this way: the subject is acting with reference to himself or herself. So I'll give you an example, exegetical insight here, Ephesians 1:4. Okay, so here we have, so this is interesting. So notice, remember I said the sigma, right? So remember, so our xi was a combination of kappa and sigma, right? But then I said that as time went on, that symbol went to symbolize anytime you had a kappa, gamma, or a chi, right? With the sigma, it becomes this. So this is the composition of the word eklego, okay? But if I take a sigma alpha for the aorist and I place it right here, drop this omega off, but I take sigma and alpha and I place it here, the gamma and the sigma become x, right? So when I see x, a ta, I know there was a sigma there, okay? That's part of the way I can tell this is an aorist plus the augment on the front. I know we haven't got to that yet, but so just look for these combinations like that. So here's the word is to be chosen. He, this is God, and this is us, and then Christ, God the Son. So he who, God, chose us in auto, in him. So this is the middle voice of chosen. Common Greek sense of the middle voice as found here is to pick out for oneself, right? Or choose for oneself. So you see that involvement. He chose, but he didn't merely choose, he chose for himself. If it was just simply he chose, it would be active voice, right? But this is a middle voice. So he chose for himself. So it takes the focus not just on the subject, but also on the action and its bearing upon the one doing it. So the middle voice suggests the action bears an additional relationship to the subject rendering it. In other words, the middle voice was used for actions in which the subject was intimately concerned with. So it's more than just focusing on the doer. right? So when we saw those early examples that he assigned, who assigned? The Lord assigned, right? So there's more of a focus on the doer there. This takes attention off the doer, and it looks also at the action. So in this case then, it's focusing on the activity and the aim of the subject of the action, which is God himself. Therefore, the idea by this word is that God chose us for himself to be his own special people. Right? So there's more involvement in that. So with the active, we saw that he assigned. Who assigned? The Lord did. That's focusing on the action and the subject, right? But then when we get to the middle voice, there's more involvement in that. So we're looking not just at the subject doing the action, but also what do they get from it, right? Or do they benefit anything from it? And again, when you look at it, he chose us in him, right? That translation doesn't carry the full weight of what's there in the Greek. So you're going to find that often, okay? When it comes to the middle voice, you're going to find that often. You're going to have elements of it not translated. So although we would call this a literal translation, because this is the NASB here, even though we would call this a literal translation, it's really not truly literal, right? Because if it was truly literal, then it would be he chose us for himself. And we would indicate that in some way. And there's different ways to do that reflexive aspect, and we'll come across it later. And then we have passive voice. Subject is being acted upon. He is being loosed. He's not doing it himself. It's happening to him. Someone else is doing the action. So in this case, then, you're going to have a doer reflected outside of the verb. So here's two verses that we know well in Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, right? So, for, and this is our article that goes with grace. For by grace you have been saved. Now this is a copulative, este, okay? Te, this is you, what? Right, that's the person. Second person plural, right? Esete. So there's no really need for this unless the author, in this case being Paul, wants to emphasize the state of existence. This is a stative verb. It's from ami. So you have all the different forms of ami. The focus of that is a stative verb, right? So same thing like say with Ephesians in chapter 2 verse 14 where it talks about Christ being our peace. It says he himself is and no one else. It's stative, right? So we call this a periphrastic perfect. This is our perfect tense right here. Reduplication, it's a participle. This ending here and this tells me this. It's passive participle. So for by grace you stand in the state of having been saved through faith, and that, this is neuter, juta, it's a broad reference, so it's everything. So some argue, well, it's looking back to faith is that which, right? When he's talking about this is a gift from God. Some think that this is referring back to faith. Some say it's referring back to salvation. It's a broad referent. Paul uses the neuter for this. And it's typical with him. It's referring to the whole entire thing, going all the way back into the previous verses. Everything is a gift from God. So when he says this, not out of, ex, humon, this is our preposition ek. So not out of, right, ourselves, Theou ta doron, of God the gift. But this is our perfect passive participle. We didn't save ourselves, he saved us. Right? And I love this because he makes a statement, uk, double negative. Know how the negative comes first. Not ex humon, not out of you, uk, ex eger. This is interesting. This is just works, not out of works. Notice he doesn't qualify it. Like not out of works of righteousness, works out of, it's just works. Anything you would consider to be a work, right? It's not out of that, right? So that no one may boast. So that's our passive voice. This is what happens to us. And oftentimes those theological statements, salvific ones, will find passive. It's what happened to us. We didn't do it ourselves. It was done to us. So then the reasoning then is, if it's something that happened to us and God did it to us, is there any way for us to remove ourselves from that which God has done? Right? I.e., can I lose my salvation? So then mood. We looked at mood is that quality of the verb that indicates the relation of the action to reality. So is the action conceived as really taking place, or is it potential? Moods address or answer these questions. So in the expression, the verbal idea, it is necessary to define its relation to reality, that which has, will, or does exist. So for an example, it is impossible to present the thought of a child running without affirming either the fact of his running, it was in the present, the past, future, or the possibility of his running. In other words, to say the child runs places the statement in the first category, and then to say if the child runs presents the second. So the child runs is a statement of fact. Simple statement, right? That's reality. If we put if on there, if the child runs, then that's potentiality, right? And usually there's a condition. We call that a condition clause. So this affirmation relation to reality then is mood. So the indicative is the mood which denotes the verbal idea as actual, and possible action may in Greek used by other moods. So I'm going to skip through these. This will just blow your mind apart. All right, so here we go. So this is what we're looking at. So essentially, all the verbs we're looking at for the most part are up here, reality, in the indicative, okay? Then we have potentiality, which drops down. We have subjunctive, the imperative. And that can make sense, right? The imperative, it's a command, right? So we would want to think, well, that's reality. No, it's potentiality. God gives a command, right? The issue is, will you obey it or will you not obey it? There's the potentiality. Will this happen? Okay? This is what he wants to happen, but... So that's the idea. So reality above the line, just statement of fact, right? The child runs. And however complex that then becomes, it's still statement of fact, it's reality, it's going to be an indicative. So for the most part, the verb forms that we look at are on the top there. It's just the indicative, right? So we've had present active indicative, future active indicative, perfect. We'll look at aorist and imperfect. All will be an indicative statement of reality. And anything drops below that is potentiality. Now, we talk about optative and subjunctive, but really all you find is subjunctive, imperative, infinitive, and then participle. Okay? And so we'll get into the technicalities of those later. So essentially, indicative is the only mood that addresses reality. The others are potentiality. So therefore, if we talk about mood, the real is the indicative, the potential, subjunctive, optative, and imperative. And we'll get into those a little bit later when we start talking about participles and infinitives and that. That's really where the idea of potentiality comes into play. So for the most part, we're above the line. So tense is kind of action, voice, subject in relation to action, the mood, the reality of action, actual or potential. All right? So perfect is tense, kind of action, active, voice, subject in relation to action, and indicative, mood, the reality of the action. And again, these things we just need to be thinking on. When we're coming across the verb forms and all of that, all of these words tell us something. And in reality, as we're outlining a passage, even when we get down to the very words, then these things inform even our outline. Right? Now, we can do a very detailed outline or we can do a general outline, but these are the things that govern that. And so that's when we're talking about drawing your outline from the text rather than imposing one on the text. That's essentially what we're doing by doing this, is we're drawing our outline as we draw these truths out from the context. And therefore, essentially, we could say that we are exegetically handling the Word of God by drawing the meaning out of the text, and therefore also our outline is coming out of the text. And so we are clearly being exegetical. And when in the earlier years, when one would talk about an expositional sermon, it was understood that was on the basis of solid exegesis, right? But some use the terms now and it doesn't mean the same thing, right? Sometimes they use the term and it's basically topical. So types of tenses, then the type of tenses, we've seen this before. Primary tenses are the unaugmented. These are the present tense, future tense, and perfect, which are the ones we're dealing with now. And then later we'll come to talk about the secondary tenses. But these are all, if you look at them on this chart, there's no augment. We'll see that when we come to the secondary tenses, imperfect, aorist, and pluperfect, and oftentimes we're looked on as being in the past, all of these we have the epsilon on the front, and this is what we call the augment. So this is the imperfect, the aorist, and then here's the pluperfect active. We have reduplication, that tells us it's perfect. We have the kappa that tells us perfect, but then we have this epsilon on the front, that's the augment that tells us it's pluperfect. Okay? So these will be in our next grouping of verb forms that we look at. So far right now we're just looking at the primary tenses, and the next will be secondary, and then we'll talk about the augment in that. So we're moving from the very simplistic forms to the more complex, because when we get to augment, then there's all kinds of changes start to happen. So primary tenses, these are our endings, present, future, and perfect, me, si, ti, mente, nsi, and the middle are passive, mai, sai, tai, meta, eset, and tai. Any questions before we dive into this? Don't be afraid. All right, so active and the middle passive endings. All right, the formation of perfect active indicative. Formation, these are, most of this is in your notes, so you should have that before you. So we'll add a few things to it though. But the features which distinguish the perfect tense are the reduplication of the stem, and then the tense sign, and then the ending. Tense sign is the kappa, right? And all those different ones I showed you, the kappa. That's the tense sign, and then we have the endings, which is the subject, right, of the action. And those are the shared ones with the present and the future. Reduplication is the thing we're going to focus on, but that's also an indicator of the perfect tense. But here's the thing. When it comes to reduplication, what we're basically talking about is it's the repetition of the initial sound. In other words, it's whatever consonant that begins the word, it's going to be reduplicated, right? So we're just reduplicating, again, the phonetic aspect, the sound of it. So originally it was used to intensify or iterate or repeat the action. Okay, so when reduplication was used, it was used before the perfect tense. In other words, you're going to find reduplicated forms in your Greek text. They're not all going to be perfects. Okay, some will be present tense. All right? But originally it was meant to intensify, and we could see that. So I'll give you an example. In Hebrew, they would do this. If they wanted to intensify something, what they would do is they would take the same word and they would use it several times. Okay? So the example everyone knows, when Isaiah, right, beholds the manifestation of God, and then the declaration in that moment, holy, 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 kadosh, 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 right? That is intensification. Okay, so it's not teaching the doctrine of the Trinity, it's focusing on the intensity, if you will, of the holiness of God. In other words, we take that, He is absolutely perfectly holy, right? That's what it's for. So when in Greek, when they wanted to intensify something, they would take it and they would reduplicate. They would take a syllable and reduplicate that syllable, and that's how they would intensify. We could see that, right? We do that with, oh, that was really, really good, right? So that's the idea behind it and how it was used. So the root reduplication existed in the parent tongue. We could see it in the parent language before Greek and that, and it exists in other languages. We can see that in English. So we see the reality of it. So both nouns and verbs went through reduplication, but among verbs is where the chief development took place. And then it was led to use in regards to the perfect. So here's a case of a noun, barbaras, right? Makes sense to us, barbarian. Right? But even in our English rendering of it, right, we have the duplication. Barbarian, right? Barbarian. So essentially that's what it was. Then they carried it over in regards to verbs. But here we have the one Bebelas is profane. Right? And then we can take those and they can turn them into verb forms. So here's an example. This is the word for a guide. Ag, ogas. So ago is to what? Brandon, you should know this one. Ago is to lead, right? So here we have reduplication. This and this right here. Okay, is essentially what happened. So we have reduplication, and it's just a guide. Here's another example. This is a simple form. We have sunago. Okay, so that's not reduplicated. This is I gather together. This is I, and this is lead or soon together, right? Or lead together or gather together. This is the word synagogue, right? So notice, lose the preposition soon together with. Here's ag, oge. Right? So just to tell you, there is reduplication everywhere. It's not just in the perfect tense. Okay? You'll find it in other words, but as you learn the perfect tense, you'll be able to point those other terms out. So here's an interesting one, Colossians 1:28. Okay? This is to carry off as spoil or to lead captive. Here is sulagogeo. Now some would think that this is the preposition soon, but it's not. Because if it was, and this is our stem right here, then this would be sulagogeo. It actually have a double lamed on the front. So the term here is sule, and then we have the reduplication of ago. Right? So reduplication wasn't just limited to the perfect, but that's really the tense that it stuck on in the development of the Greek language. All right? So this is actually a present passive participle. And this is the breakdown of it. Ba is the root, and it was reduplicated. Beba, which is standing fast. So you take ba and you put be on the front of it. You want to intensify it, right? And so we have not merely just standing, but standing fast. So in the original, it would be placed on that to intensify it. So this is the term that you'll look up in your dictionary and you'll find bebeao, which is to confirm or to establish. Bebeas in the noun form is firm, secure in the sense of legally guaranteed security. So in this particular verse, having been rooted, this is perfect tense. Having been rooted and being built up, this is present tense. Having been rooted and continuously being built up in the faith and being strengthened, are being rendered steadfast. And it's a present passive participle. It's what happens to us. So you'll see reduplication, okay? Just keep in mind, though, that just because you see reduplication doesn't mean this is going to be the perfect. So you'll see this, then what leads you to do is look at the end of the word, and that will be the telltale. Okay? That will help you determine what it is, if it's a present or a perfect. So the most common reduplication in Greek is in the perfect tense. Therefore, the most distinguishing feature for this tense is the reduplication of the stem. Now see why I didn't deal with the end of words too? Just reduplication is enough by itself. All right? So Robertson Davis made this statement: it is an integral part of all the moods, voices, and persons until its disappearance in a later Greek. Okay? So in the Greek, Koine Greek of the New Testament, there was this transition, and it was moving towards being pinned towards the perfect tense. So reduplication in the perfect tense was used to help express the idea of completion in the verb form. However, this is not the only element significant to the perfect tense. All right, so let's talk about reduplication. Now I'm going to introduce this to you and then just let it float. Okay, so don't stress it. We'll keep coming back to this. But it's going back to the alphabet. Okay, so we're just talking about adding to the front of the word. And this is all in your notes and the examples. So you can go home and check on it. So here it is. Verb stems beginning with an aspirated letter such as phi, theta, or ki. There is dissimilation of the aspirates to the deaspirated unvoiced consonants. So remember, it was paha, taha, kaha, right? It's just basic, okay? So going back to that, we keep in mind these are just the symbols to reflect what happened. It's just a combination of our unvoiced plus aspiration. Okay? So knowing that then here is our word. Okay? So we have thnesko. Alright? So I'm going to make it perfect. Well, when I do that, I'm going to have reduplication. So I'm going to take this first consonant and I'm going to reduplicate. I'm going to make another syllable, and it's thethneka. Okay? I know I'm doing interdental, but I'm just keeping it simple for you. So what happens is they don't like two aspirated letters like this. So this is going to cause this to deaspirate, and it becomes tethneka. Right? But we know why it does that. Right? Because that's all theta is taha. Right? So instead of having two aspirated forms in the front, the other one causes the one before it to deaspirate. Verb stems beginning with a vowel lengthen the vowel to form reduplication. So in this case, it's not going to double the syllable, add another syllable to it, right? Like if we did the, right? Or la, luo, right? If we want to put that on the front. So when you have a verb that begins with the vowel, this is what happens. So elpidzo, I hope, becomes elpika. So notice, here's the kappa. This tells me that it's perfect. But in this case, I'm going to lengthen the epsilon to an eta, right? And it's just going back to our vowels, right? Early chart. Epsilon is always short. Omicron is always short, right? Eta and omega are always long. And eta is the long of epsilon. All right? So ago, same thing. Alpha, lengthened to an eta, which we know can happen, right? And this is my middle and passive ending. Angelo, all we do is we're going to take the alpha, we're going to lengthen to an eta, and here's my kappa. This is my perfect ending. All right? So we'll start off easy. Most of the time, just start indicating the reduplication. Over time, you'll get to understand these other forms. But they also go back to their roots. Verbs beginning with two consonants, a double consonant, right? Or a row often will reduplicate by adding an epsilon, which looks like an augment, right? So here we have gnosko. But the root of gnosko is gno, like in our English K-N-O, right, for to know. Well, that's where we get it from, gno, to know. Gnosis, so sis at the end, is the act of gno, knowing. Gnosis. So what happens is that to form the perfect, it's going to go back to its triliteral root. And again, this is why we talk about it in regards to language, that understanding that everything is built off of those roots, because with the perfect and the aorist, these are two occasions when you're going to have a word go back to its root form and then be built off of that, right? So we will think, well, this is the root of where it all starts from, then we're going to make a perfect off of this. No, it actually goes back to its root, then they would make the perfect off of it. So if we look in our Greek text, egnoka, this is our perfect that we'll find. Here's our kappa, so that's a nice help that tells us perfect. And then we have the epsilon on the front, which is not an augment, it's actually in place of reduplication. The other thing is interesting is that, notice, this is a consonant, this is a consonant. Okay? So that's another thing that happens. When you have a word that begins with a double consonant, it won't reduplicate itself. It'll just take the epsilon in the front. So, here's an example. Okay? Perfect passive indicative. So this is aorist passive, right? Talking about creation, right? For in him was created ektiste. This is aorist passive. This is looking back to creation, right? This is what happened. Statement of fact. It occurred, right? Which we know over a 6-day period, right? But it's all summed up and was created in him. Okay? So it's just a statement of fact of what happened. Then we go back to Genesis. We know that it took 6 days to do so. But this sums up those 6 days in one statement. It occurred. All things were created. Tapanta were created in him. Now this right here is a perfect passive indicative. because our word starts with two consonants, kappa and tau, it takes the epsilon on the front of it. Now this one's a little more confusing because notice, we have kappa tau and we have epsilon on the front. We have kappa tau and we have epsilon on the front. One's an aorist passive and the other one's a perfect. All right? This helps me understand it's a perfect because of the tie ending. Aorist doesn't take these endings. All right? So essentially he's making a play off of these two things. Were created and then have been created. The first is an aorist tense, expressing a historical fact of creation. The second is perfect tense, stating a fixed, finished condition, literally stands created. All right? That one's a little more confusing. More often than not, you'll see the reduplication, the endings, you'll know it's a perfect and it won't be, is this an aorist or what is it? So essentially the point then is that creation stands in a state of continuously existing towards the Creator. Or it stands in permanent createdness, if you will, in relation to Christ. I'll pass through all this stuff. So if we have a row, okay, so if we have, in this case, so if a verb begins with two consonants or a double consonant, it's going to take the epsilon, or row, often will reduplicate it. So notice what happens. So here we have a case. This is in Colossians chapter 2, verse 7. This is a perfect tense. Fridzao is our verb, perfect passive participle. Okay, and notice we have the duplication on the front of here. But this is perfect passive. We stand in the state of being rooted in, and then these are both present tense. Being built up and being rendered steadfast or stable. So it's having been rooted in, these two things are now happening out of that. And then verbs in compound form, preposition prefix to the verb, the reduplication becomes between the preposition and the verb. So here is apostello, which we all know. This tells me it's perfect, ka, right? And notice else what happens. Stello. This goes back to towards its root, stal. Okay, so this is another thing that help you indicate that it's perfect. And like I said, with gnosko, right? It's going to do the same thing, gno, go back to its root. So you're going to look for the kappa, you'll see it going back to its root, and then you'll have the augment that goes between, here's the preposition and here's the stem that's going to be attached. You're going to have the a in here. So that's perfect. So these four examples are going to take a while. Just keep going back through them and looking at the examples. At first, it's going to be slow going, but you'll start picking up on it. You'll see the kappa, you'll see the root, and then then look to the reduplication. For the most part, everything is going to be like the reduplication, le, lu, ka, right? It'll have the le, and then there, and you'll figure that out. So for the most part, it'll be like that, but these are just some variations that happen with the augment. All right. And when we get to the aorist, you'll be able to distinguish between whether it's an augment or whether it's the perfect tense in its reduplication. Confusing, I know. This is why we didn't deal with endings too, but just get a sense of this. We'll keep coming back and looking at different perfect forms, but that's really essentially what we're looking for. Reduplication, tense stem sign, the kappa, and then what is the ending? And the ending will be primary tenses, right? Just like the present and the future. Questions, complexities?